The Krillian Dominion had ruled the outer edges of the galaxy for over 3,000 years, and nobody questioned their power. These weren't just your average space bullies. Their warships were absolutely massive. We're talking the size of small moons here. When a Krillian dreadnought showed up in your star system, you had two choices: surrender immediately or get turned into space dust. Commander Vexthar was sitting in his command center aboard the flagship Death Shadow, going through the usual stack of intelligence reports. Most of it was boring stuff. Trade routes, minor rebellions that got crushed before they even started, the typical day-to-day business of running a galactic empire through fear. But then something made him stop and lean forward in his chair. A new species had been discovered. "Hey, Tommy." Vexthar called to the second-in-command, using the crude translation his universal communicator gave him for the alien's actual name. "Come look at this weird discovery." Tommy walked over, his forearms clicking against the metal floor. The holographic display showed what looked like the most pathetic species either of them had ever seen. These creatures called themselves humans, and honestly, it was almost funny how weak they appeared. "Look at these things," Vexthar said with a laugh. "They walk on just two legs. How do they even balance? Their skin looks softer than a newborn Zephyrian. No claws, no natural armor, no poison glands, no nothing. What do they fight with? Harsh language." The data was even more amusing. These humans had only recently figured out how to travel faster than light, which was basically like a toddler taking their first steps in the galactic community. Their home planet was called Earth, a small blue world that looked disgustingly peaceful from the orbital photos. No massive weapon platforms, no ring defenses, no asteroid fortresses. Just a pretty little planet with white clouds and way too much water. "Sir, look at their ships," Tommy pointed out, barely containing his laughter. They actually look like they're held together with metal scraps and prayers to whatever gods these creatures believe in. Vexthar studied the images of human spacecraft. They were tiny compared to Krillian vessels, and they looked so fragile that a strong solar wind might blow them apart. The humans had apparently been sending out what they called colony ships to nearby star systems. But these vessels moved so slowly that a Krillian messenger drone could lap them 3 times before they reached their destination. The intelligence report estimated about 8 billion humans on their home world. 8 billion soft, weak, essentially defenseless creatures who had somehow managed to survive long enough to develop space travel. It was almost impressive in its own pathetic way. "What kind of weapons do they have?" Vexthar asked, scrolling through the tactical analysis. "Primitive kinetic projectiles, some basic energy weapons, nuclear devices that would barely scratch our ship's paint." Tommy read from his datapad. "Sir, my grandmother's cooking pot could probably withstand their strongest weapons." Vexthar stood up and walked to the massive viewport that looked out over his fleet. Hundreds of Krillian warships floated in perfect formation, each one a masterpiece of destruction that had been refined over millennia of conquest. His personal ship alone carried enough firepower to crack a planet's crust, and he commanded over 200 similar vessels. The Dominion Council meeting the next day was probably the shortest in galactic history. When Vexthar presented the human data, the discussion lasted exactly 47 seconds. Every council member agreed immediate subjugation of this new species, not because they pose any threat, but because leaving them alone might give other weak species the wrong idea about Krillian dominance. "I'll handle this personally," Vexthar announced, and nobody argued. After all, why send a massive invasion force against creatures that probably couldn't even dent their armor? The plan was simple and had worked perfectly for 3,000 years. Jump into their system with overwhelming force, demand surrender, accept their submission, and add another slave species to the empire. The humans would probably wet themselves the moment they saw Krillian dreadnoughts materializing in their sky. Vexthar estimated the entire operation would take maybe a week, including travel time, a few orbital bombardments of their military installations, maybe land some troops to round up any holdouts, and then it was back home for victory celebrations and promotions all around. As his fleet prepared to jump to human space, Vexthar felt that familiar satisfaction of another easy conquest ahead. These humans looked so weak and unprepared that part of him almost felt bad about what was to happen to them. Almost. Set course for Earth, he commanded, settling back into his captain's chair. Let's go introduce these humans to the reality of galactic politics. The jump coordinates were locked in, the fleet was ready, and Vexthar was already planning his victory speech. He expected the usual pattern that had played out thousands of times before across hundreds of worlds. Shock, terror, and swift surrender from another inferior species. He had absolutely no idea that he was about to encounter something that would change everything the Krillians thought they knew about warfare, survival, and what it really meant to be a predator in the vast darkness of space. The invasion of human space started exactly like every other conquest in Krillian history. Vexthar's fleet dropped out of hyperspace near the first human colony world, weapons charged and ready for the usual show of overwhelming force. The colony was called New Haven, a small farming settlement with maybe 50,000 people. Broadcast surrender demands. Vexthar ordered, settling back in his command chair with satisfaction. This was going to be over before lunch. The orbital bombardment lasted exactly 12 minutes, just enough to take out their communication arrays and any defensive positions. Standard procedure. When the smoke cleared, Krillian dropships descended toward the colony's main settlement, ready to accept the inevitable surrender. But when the doors opened, Lieutenant Zekmor's voice came through the comm with confusion instead of triumph. "Sir, we've secured a landing zone, but there's a problem." "What kind of problem?" Vexthar asked, though he wasn't really worried. What kind of problem could these primitive humans possibly cause? "The colony is empty, sir. I mean completely empty. We've swept the entire settlement. No bodies, no signs of fighting, no indication anyone was even here when we hit them." Vexthar frowned. "They evacuated? Check the surrounding areas. They probably ran into the wilderness when they saw our ships." But 3 days of searching turned up nothing. 50,000 humans had simply vanished without a trace. Their homes were intact. Meals were still on tables. Vehicles sat in driveways with keys and ignition. It was like everyone had just stepped outside for a moment and forgotten to come back. Maybe they had advance warning, suggested Tommy, but even he didn't sound convinced. Some kind of early evacuation protocol? The second colony, Harmony Falls, fell the same way. Then the third. By the time they hit the 7 human settlement, Vexthar was starting to feel genuinely disturbed. 7 colonies, over 500,000 people, and not a single human captured or accounted for. Species didn't just disappear. In 3,000 years of conquest, Vexthar had seen aliens run, hide, fight desperately, even commit mass suicide rather than face slavery. But he'd never seen an entire population vanish like morning fog. Then the weird stuff started happening. It began with missing supply convoys. The cargo ship Brutal Harvest left the supply depot with a full load of ammunition and rations for the occupation forces. It never arrived. No distress call, no debris field, no trace on any sensors. Like it had just stopped existing somewhere between point A and point B. Pirates, Tommy suggested, but they both knew better. What pirates could make a heavily armed Krillian freighter disappear without even a radio squawk? The pattern got worse. Patrol ships would launch routine sweeps and turn up 3 days later, drifting dead in space. When boarding teams investigated, they found the ships completely intact but empty. No crew, no signs of struggle, and somehow their computer cores had been wiped cleaner than a factory reset. "It's like they just walked off their own ships," muttered Captain Rexstar after inspecting the 3rd ghost vessel. "But that's impossible. You can't survive in vacuum, and the life pods were still in place." Vexthar tried to maintain confidence in front of his officers, but privately he was starting to feel something he'd never experienced in over 200 years of military service. Genuine confusion mixed with growing unease. The situation escalated when his ground forces started reporting impossible encounters. Krillian soldiers would secure an area, post sentries, set up proper defensive perimeters with overlapping field of fire and motion sensors. Military procedure that had worked for millennia. Then they'd wake up to find half their equipment gone. "The guards swear they saw nothing," reported Sergeant Croctus after the 5th incident. "The motion sensors show empty corridors all night. The security cameras recorded nothing but shadows. But somehow our ammunition stockpile, 3 portable generators, and a communications array just walked away. Worse were the sightings. Reconnaissance drones started picking up impossible readings. Humans moving around on airless moons without environmental suits. At first, Vexstar assumed it was equipment malfunction, but the reports kept coming from different drones, different operators, different locations. "Sir, you need to see this," called his sensor operator, his voice tight with disbelief. Long-range probe just spotted movement on Kepler 7b. Vexstar looked at the display showing a barren rock of a moon with no atmosphere and surface temperatures that would freeze Krillian blood solid. The thermal imaging clearly showed humanoid figures moving across the landscape, apparently unbothered by conditions that should have killed them instantly. "Equipment malfunction," he declared. But even as he said it, more reports were coming in. Humans spotted in the crushing depths of gas giant atmospheres, breathing toxic clouds like fresh air. Humans moving through radiation fields that would cook a Krillian in seconds. "Sir," whispered Captain Velmore during a private meeting, "what exactly are we dealing with here? These creatures, they're not following the rules." That was the problem. Vexstar realized every species they'd ever conquered had followed predictable patterns. They had environmental limitations, physical weaknesses, logical responses to superior force. But these humans seemed to ignore every biological law the Krillians understood. The final straw came when Lieutenant Jackson L. reported seeing a human figure standing on the outer hull of the patrol ship, apparently studying the engine configuration with casual interest. In hard vacuum, without a suit. "It waved at me," Jackson L. said quietly, his 4 eyes wide with shock. "I swear by the void, sir. It looked right at me through the viewport and waved like we were neighbors meeting on the street." For the first time in his long military career, Commander Vexstar felt something creeping up his spine that he'd never experienced before. These humans weren't behaving like prey animals running from predators. They were behaving like researchers studying interesting specimens. And somehow, that terrified him more than any weapon ever could. The Blood Fleet's arrival at Earth was supposed to be the grand finale of this pathetic little war. Vexstar had brought his entire armada, over 300 of the Krillian Dominion's most feared warships. This wasn't just an invasion force anymore, it was a statement. He was going to make an example of humanity that would echo across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. "All ships, assume attack formation," Vexstar commanded as they dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system. "Let's show these primitive creatures what real power looks like." But as the tactical displays lit up with sensor data, something was immediately wrong. Earth hung in space like a beautiful blue marble, exactly as the intelligence reports had described. The problem was what wasn't there. "Sir," his sensor officer called out, voice tight with confusion, "I'm not picking up any population centers. No major cities, no industrial complexes, no communication traffic. It's like the planet is completely empty." Vexstar stared at the readouts in disbelief. "That's impossible. Run the scans again. 8 billion humans don't just disappear." 3 more sensor sweeps confirmed the impossible. Earth's major cities were dark. No orbital traffic, no defensive fleets scrambling to intercept them, no desperate radio broadcasts begging for mercy. The entire planet appeared to have been abandoned. "Where did they all go?" whispered Tommy, studying his own displays with growing alarm. That's when the new contacts appeared on their screens. Massive structures hung in Earth's orbit like deadly metal flowers, each one easily the size of a Krillian cruiser. They hadn't been there in any of the intelligence reports, which meant the humans had built them in the few months since the invasion began. But that was impossible. Construction on this scale should take years, even with advanced technology. "Those are defense platforms," announced Lieutenant Bextor from his weapons station. "But, sir, look at the energy signatures. Those aren't human designs." Vexstar felt his stomach drop as he studied the tactical analysis. The weapons mounted on those platforms were definitely Krillian in origin, the same plasma cannons and particle beams his own ships carried. But there was something different about them, something that made his veteran weapons officer nervous. "Sir, those look like our Mark 7 plasma rays, but the power output readings are off the charts. They're generating 3 times more energy than our versions." "Impossible." We've been perfecting those weapons for centuries. I know, sir, but somehow they've taken our designs and improved them. The first test came when Vextar ordered a probing attack. A single squadron of his fastest fighters swept toward the nearest platform, weapons charged and ready to test the human defenses. The platform's response was immediate and devastating. Plasma bolts that should have taken several minutes to charge fired continuously like machine guns. The fighters barely had time to register the incoming fire before they were reduced to glowing debris. "How are they doing that?" demanded Captain Krellmath. "Those weapons should overheat after 3 shots. But it got worse, much worse. When Vextar ordered his main battle group to engage, the platforms didn't just fight back, they fought smart. Every shot was perfectly calculated to hit weak points in Krillian armor. Every defensive maneuver seemed to anticipate his attack patterns 3 moves ahead. "It's like they know exactly what we're going to do before we do it," muttered his tactical officer, sweat beading on his scaled forehead despite the cool bridge air. Vextar tried to maintain confidence for his crew. They're automated systems, impressive programming, but no real intelligence behind them. Computers can't match Krillian tactical genius. He ordered complex attack patterns, feints and diversions that should have confused any automated defense system. Instead, the platforms responded with maneuvers so sophisticated that his own tactical AI couldn't predict their next move. Then came the report that changed everything. Sergeant Kroll's voice crackled through the comm from his assault shuttle, which had managed to breach one of the smaller platforms. But instead of triumph, his voice was filled with something Vextar had never heard from the veteran soldier before: pure terror. "Sir, we've breached the platform's outer hull, but there's something you need to know." "Report, Sergeant. The platforms aren't automated, sir. They're crewed. There are humans inside, working the weapons manually." Vextar felt confused. "So? Capture them and be done with it." "Sir, you don't understand. They're not wearing environmental suits. They're working in hard vacuum, like it's a comfortable room. And, sir, their reflexes. I've been in combat for 40 years, and I've never seen anything move that fast." The implications hit Vextar like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just abandoned Earth. They'd turned the entire planet into a trap. And somehow, in the span of just a few months, they had adapted to survive in conditions that should have killed them instantly. "Sir, we're getting reports from all boarding teams," Tommy announced, his voice barely steady. "The humans, they're not just surviving in vacuum, they're thriving in it. And, sir, they're studying our soldiers like we're interesting specimens." One of the human defenders had apparently approached Sergeant Kroll with what the Universal Translator interpreted as casual curiosity, asking questions about Krillian anatomy and combat techniques, while bullets were still flying around them. As his fleet suffered losses unlike anything in Krillian military history, Vextar realized a horrible truth. The humans hadn't evacuated Earth because they were afraid. They had evacuated Earth because they were preparing, and somehow, in ways that violated everything the Krillians understood about biology and physics, they had adapted not just to survive his assault, but to turn it into their advantage. These weren't the same weak creatures his intelligence reports had described. These were something entirely new, and Vextar was starting to understand that his fleet might not be the hunters in this situation after all. The retreat order should have been the simplest command Vextar had ever given. After centuries of conquest, the Krillian military had perfected the art of tactical withdrawal. Fall back in good order, regroup at a safe distance, call for reinforcements, and return with overwhelming force. It was basic military doctrine that had worked flawlessly for 3,000 years. All ships, withdraw to rally point Zeta 7. Vextar commanded, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. This wasn't defeat, it was just an unexpected setback. The humans had gotten lucky with their orbital defenses, but luck wouldn't save them from the full might of the Dominion. His flagship, the mighty Death Shadow, began turning away from Earth along with the remainder of his battered fleet. They'd lost nearly a third of their ships to those impossible defense platforms, but the surviving vessels were still more than enough to handle any pursuit from primitive human forces. That's when the impossible happened. "Sir, contact bearing 27 Mark IV, his sensor operator suddenly called out, panic creeping into his voice. What kind of contact? Vexthar demanded, spinning toward the tactical display. Unknown vessels, sir, but it's firing on us. The Death Shadows shuddered under the impact of weapons that shouldn't exist. Energy signatures that matched advanced Krillian plasma cannons, but with power output that exceeded anything in their arsenal. The impossible part wasn't just the weapons. It was that the attacking ship hadn't been there 2 seconds ago. Where did it come from? Vexthar roared, but before anyone could answer, more contact appeared on the display. Dozens of them, materializing out of empty space like ghosts becoming solid. Sir, they're using our own cloaking technology. Lieutenant Brickstow reported, his voice high with disbelief. But the stealth signatures are completely invisible to our sensors. It's like they improved our own designs beyond recognition. Ships that shouldn't exist were attacking with weapons they shouldn't possess, using stealth technology that made Krillian cloaking devices look like children's toys. And they weren't just attacking randomly. Every shot was precise, every maneuver coordinated with military precision that would have impressed Krillian tactical instructors. How is this possible? Tommy whispered, watching their fleet get torn apart by enemies that appeared and disappeared like deadly phantoms. We've had cloaking technology for 800 years. How did they master it and improve it in just a few months? Vexthar didn't have an answer, but he was getting desperate for one. His once mighty blood fleet was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that fought like they'd studied every Krillian tactical manual ever written. Then Sergeant Crow's voice crackled to the comm with the first good news in hours. Sir, boarding Team 7 has captured a prisoner. Bring them to the bridge immediately. Vexthar ordered. Finally, he'd get some answers about how these primitive humans had suddenly become more dangerous than any enemy the Dominion had ever faced. The human prisoner was not what he expected. She was young, maybe in her 20s by human standards, with short brown hair and the kind of steady eyes that belonged on a veteran soldier, not someone from a species that had barely discovered faster-than-light travel. She didn't struggle against her restraints, didn't seem frightened by the bridge full of alien predators surrounding her, didn't even look particularly concerned about her situation. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, Earth Defense Corps, she said calmly when asked to identify herself. Her voice was polite, almost friendly, like she was introducing herself at a social gathering instead of being interrogated by hostile aliens. Your technology, Vexthar snarled, his patience finally snapping. Those ships, those weapons, that cloaking system, how did you steal our designs? What kind of spies do you have in our fleet? Amy tilted her head slightly, like she was considering an interesting but slightly silly question from a child. We didn't steal anything, Commander, she said with what seemed like genuine amusement. We learned every weapon you fired at our colonies, every tactic you used against our people, every piece of technology you brought to our space. We studied all of it. We figured out how it worked, understood the principles behind it, and then we made it better. That's impossible. Vexthar spat. No species develops that quickly. Technological advancement takes centuries of research and development. Amy's smile was the most unsettling thing Vexthar had ever seen. It wasn't cruel or mocking. It was patient and understanding, like a teacher explaining something obvious to a confused student. Evolution? Commander, you're thinking about this all wrong. We didn't evolve or develop new technology. We just stopped holding back. Holding back from what? From being what we've always been, Amy replied, her voice taking on a tone that somehow made the temperature on the bridge feel like it had dropped several degrees. See, you made a fundamental mistake about humans. You looked at our peaceful little colonies and our basic technology and assumed we were prey animals, harmless creatures who just happened to develop space travel. Vexthar felt something cold crawling up his spine as Amy continued. But humans aren't prey, Commander. We never were. We're the apex predator of any environment we enter. Your dominion, your technology, your entire military doctrine, it's all just another environment for us to master. You're just one species among billions, Vexthar protested, but his voice sounded weak even to himself. Amy's smile widened, and somehow those perfectly normal human teeth looked absolutely terrifying. One species that just turned your own fleet against you using technology we learned by watching you use it. One species that made your 3,000-year military advantage obsolete in a few months. Commander, you didn't invade human space. You gave us a masterclass in galactic warfare, and we were very, very good students. As explosions rocked his flagship and the sound of battle echoed to the corridors, Vexstar finally understood the horrible truth. The humans hadn't been defending themselves. They had been learning. Only 17 ships made it back to Krillian space out of the 300 that had left for Earth. 17 battered, limping vessels filled with shell-shocked crews who kept muttering about impossible things they'd witnessed. Vexstar's flagship was among them, but barely. Half the ship's systems were offline, and emergency bulkheads sealed off entire sections that had been vented to space. The journey home took 3 weeks, and every day Vexstar stared out at the stars, trying to process what had happened. 3,000 years of unbroken military dominance, ended by a species that had been using faster-than-light travel for less than a century. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been possible, but the evidence was floating around him in the form of his broken fleet. The emergency session of the Dominion Council was held in the Great Chamber on Krillos Prime, beneath the statues of ancient conquerors who had built the Empire through pure military might. Vexstar stood before the assembled leaders, still wearing his battle-damaged uniform, and tried to explain what he'd encountered. "Honored Council," he began, his voice hoarse from stress and exhaustion. "Humanity is not what we thought they were. They're not another primitive species to be conquered. There's something far more dangerous." Council Speaker Thexvar leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Commander, your reports speak of impossible technologies and humans surviving in hard vacuum. Are you certain you weren't dealing with some kind of advanced alien species pretending to be human?" "No, sir. They were human, but they don't think like other species we've encountered. They don't want territory or resources or slaves. They want something much worse. They want to understand us completely." The council chamber erupted in confused murmurs. Understanding? What kind of threat was understanding? "They study everything," Vexstar continued, his voice growing more urgent. "Every weapon we used, every tactic we employed, every biological detail about our species. They absorb it all like sponges. They're not conquerors, they're researchers, and we're their latest research project." Council Speaker Thexvar's expression hardened. "Commander Vexstar, you're describing impossible evolutionary adaptation and claiming an entire species transformed itself in months. This sounds like the desperate excuses of a defeated officer trying to explain away military failure." The council voted to strip Vexstar of his command and exile him to a remote agricultural world. His warnings were officially dismissed as combat stress and delusional thinking brought on by unprecedented defeat. That lasted exactly 6 weeks. The first reports came from border stations in the Outer Rim. Small groups of humans were appearing throughout Krillian space, but they weren't attacking or occupying anything. They were asking questions. Commander Brixton of Outpost Sentinel 9 sent a confused report that would become legendary in Krillian military history. A human male calling himself Dr. James Mitchell arrived at our station yesterday requesting permission to study our military protocols. He spoke perfect Krillian, claimed to be an anthropologist, and asked if we'd mind answering some questions about predator behavior patterns. For science, he said. The pattern spread throughout Krillian space like a plague of curiosity. Humans appeared everywhere, not as invaders, but as polite, friendly researchers who somehow knew exactly where to find military installations, research facilities, and government centers. They survived in environments that should have killed them instantly. They learned local languages in days instead of months. They asked incredibly specific questions about Krillian biology, technology, and military doctrine with the kind of focus intensity that scientists usually reserve for laboratory specimens. "Excuse me," Dr. Patricia Wells had said to Admiral Kexmore at the supposedly secret Fleet Command Base Omega-7. "We're conducting a comprehensive study of galactic military hierarchies. Would you mind explaining your command structure? We're particularly interested in how you coordinate between different species in your empire." Within 6 months, every major Krillian installation had been visited by human research teams. They didn't steal anything, didn't sabotage anything, didn't threaten anyone. They just observed everything with the kind of systematic thoroughness that made veteran soldiers nervous. The humans took detailed notes on Kryllian anatomy, recorded their social interactions, documented their technology with precision that impressed even Kryllian scientists. They were studying the entire Dominion like it was a fascinating but ultimately primitive culture that they wanted to understand completely. The most disturbing reports came from interaction logs. The humans didn't treat Kryllians like enemies or even equals. They treated them like interesting animals whose behavior patterns were worth documenting for future reference. The subject displays typical alpha predator territorial responses. One human researcher had noted while observing a Kryllian military exercise. Note the hierarchical pack behavior and ritualized dominance displays. Excellent examples of evolutionary adaptation to apex predator lifestyle. Vexthar, living in exile on a farming colony, received thousands of similar reports from former colleagues who were beginning to understand that his warnings hadn't been the ravings of a defeated commander. The humans were conducting a species-wide dissection of everything the Kryllians had built over 3 millennia. Then came the personal message that haunted his nightmares. It arrived on a standard data pad, addressed specifically to him, with Earth Defense Corps identification codes that shouldn't have existed in Kryllian space. The message was from Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, the human prisoner he'd interrogated during the battle for Earth. For words, thanks to the education. That was all. No threats, no demands, no gloating. Just a polite thank you note from a species that had turned his entire civilization into their personal learning laboratory. The age of human expansion had begun, but not the way anyone expected. They weren't conquering through superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. They were conquering through complete understanding, by learning everything there was to know about every species they encountered, and then becoming better at being those species than the original inhabitants. For every other civilization in the galaxy, the terrifying reality was becoming clear. When dealing with humans, the question wasn't whether you were predator or prey. The question was how long it would take them to understand you so completely that the distinction no longer mattered. And judging by what had happened to the Kryllian Dominion, the answer was not very long at all.